Well, welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark. I'm a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute. I'm a director of the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology also. Thank you all for tuning in or for coming here in person. We are really lucky today to have with us Aditi Kumar, who's the Deputy Director of the Defense Innovation Unit over at the Department of Defense, where she leads efforts on strategy, policy, and national security partnerships. So a fairly big portfolio in what Defense Innovation Unit does. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Prior to her current position, Aditi was also a senior advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. And so she's been working in DoD for a while. And then previous to that, she had some jobs outside of DoD. We won't get into those.
No, have to get into those.
But thank you very much for being here with us.
Yeah, and thank you to all of you coming on a cold day. So I appreciate it.
So what we wanted to talk about today is some of the signature efforts that the Defense Innovation Unit has going on, and in particular Replicator, the Replicator Initiative, and then also DIU's approach to how it's helping to orchestrate and sort of lead the department's efforts towards innovation, which is obviously a very hot topic. We've got a new administration coming in. Yes. We had the Reagan National Defense Forum last week where a lot of the tech community was out making the case for new approaches to defense acquisition and new technologies to be adopted more quickly. And Defense Innovation Unit is at the center of all that. So there's a lot to talk about. But to start, let's talk about Replicator and progress on Replicator. The department started Replicator about 1.5 years ago. Yep. And is designed to initially produce larger numbers of uncrewed systems in Replicator 1. Now we're moving on to Replicator 2, which is the next iteration, next tranche of systems. So how is Replicator going, and how are we moving out on Replicator 1 and 2?
Sure. So we're 16 months into Replicator 1. We have 8 months to go. Looking back when it was first launched and thinking through the timelines of how are we going to do this in 24 months, it was very daunting. 16 months in, though, we're in good shape. As you probably know, there are 2 goals for Replicator. One is capability delivery, which is, in this case, delivering multiple thousands of attritable autonomous systems in multiple domains. So we're on track to do that. Our acquisition enterprise is sprinting, and our commercial vendors are sprinting to pull these off of the production lines and get them into the hands of the warfighter. The other goal of Replicator is one of process improvement and acceleration. So we're going to do all of this in 18 to 24 months, which includes fielding, so in the hands of the warfighter. And so we're on track to do that as well. As you mentioned, the Secretary announced the second iteration of Replicator, Replicator 2, in September, and that's going to be focused on doing exactly the same thing, 18 to 24 months, a pretty ambitious fielding challenge for counter UAS systems. So now we're executing both in parallel. Some lessons learned from 1 that we're already applying to 2, which I would like to share. First is being very transparent and communicating early and frequently with the commercial sector on what exactly we're going after. So last week, the Secretary announced the counter unmanned system strategy, and he was at DIU, and we moderated a roundtable with commercial sector participants and with investors to really clarify our demand signal and the types of systems and capabilities that we will be pursuing as part of Replicator 2. I think that will get us off on the right foot and accelerating quickly with commercial sector as partners. Right. The second lesson is start early on the hardest problems, which in many cases are the software problems. And so for Replicator 1, we're doing a whole host of things related to collaborative autonomy and command and control, which I'm sure we'll get into. For Replicator 2, we have a similar challenge with command and control across these systems, so we're starting that now. And you would have seen, for example, DIU has a live solicitation right now looking at counter UAS command and control, and so we're going to get ahead of that challenge early. And then the last, there are many lessons, but the third one I'll highlight is early and frequent communications with Congress. And so we have already been on the Hill talking to them about what Replicator 2 looks like, what types of capabilities we're looking to field, and in what locations. so that there are early supporters as we think about funding this enormous challenge.
Right. Well, those are good lessons to draw from the effort, I'm sure. So a question or a couple of questions come out of that. One is, how do you address the challenge of trying to deliver fast with what's more or less available from the industrial base, and balancing that against the fact that the operational problems you're trying to solve may not be amenable to the exact solutions that are available today? So how do we make those two things mesh? Do we accept some delay in the fielding of systems to do some adaptation on the technology, or do we come up with an alternative way to solve the problem that uses what's available? I mean, how do you square that?
Yes, it's absolutely true that the technology for autonomous systems, for example, is evolving rapidly. So what's cutting edge today, if we do our job right, should not be the cutting edge in 2027 and beyond. But I would say, number one, we have to field these systems at scale with a steady demand signal now. Otherwise, we will never incentivize the commercial sector to innovate, to get to the cutting edge in 2027. And so I think we have to do both. We have to scale now. And secondly, this is version 0, but you have to put out version 0 and put in place smart ways of acquisition and upgrading to allow you to keep pace with technology, and that's what we're doing. One way in which we're doing that is on the software side. So how do we acquire software solutions in a modular fashion such that we can update the software and integrate that with the hardware at a more frequent pace than you can update the hardware? Another thing that we're doing is investing heavily in data aggregation and data labeling so that the models of the data that the models are trained on have the latest, and we're constantly updating that database so those models can get sharper and sharper.
Right. So you're looking at, essentially, the Replicator's attempting to, in part, jumpstart the industry's ability to feel or build these systems at scale. And we're going to have to adapt the way we use them, and we're going to have to use software as a way to mitigate the potential mismatch in terms of, this is not the exact system I'd want, but we can use it in the near term with this sort of different tactic or this different software approach to managing it.
Yeah, and I would say we have to, as I said, we have to do that, because if, my boss will love that I said this, but if Apple had sat around until they could, field the latest iPhone, we would never have had all the earlier versions, and we would never actually have gotten to this version because of all the feedback that you get along the way. And so I think we have to get out there. And for the commercial sector, for our partners, that demand needs to be scaled and it needs to be constant. Otherwise, we will never incentivize the type of behavior that will keep us ahead on the tech curve.
Which brings up the idea of DIU 3.0 and what DIU has been doing with the warfighters, because clearly one of the ways that you work through this need to jumpstart industry but also solve problems is you need to have the warfighters involved to be able to come up with a solution that works with what's available on the shelf and adapt over time and then feedback to the next iteration of it. So how are you guys working with the operational community, and is that at the combatant command level? Is it down at the tactical level? How is that happening?
It's all of the above. And I would say that DIU is unique in that we do work across those three communities, really, the warfighters, the combatant commands, the services, because we need those transition partners who will scale the technologies, and with the commercial sector. I don't know of any other entity in the department that is working at that intersection as closely as we are. So on the combatant command side, it requires us to have a distributed presence. So we have placed embeds, for example, in Indo-PACOM, in EUCOM, and other combatant commands. And the embeds are at the highest levels of the organization, where they have visibility into the commander's priorities, and they can bring those back into our investment and acquisition decisions that we're making. And then, as we are thinking about both delivery and fielding of Replicator 1, in this case, Indo-PACOM is front and center. Replicator 1 is about countering the PRC challenge. And so that partnership exists at all levels with Indo-PACOM. They are involved in obviously defining the operational need, which drove our requirements when we first set out to do this. They are partners in developing and iterating the concept of operations. So as we learn more about these systems, and even the past 16 months, the technology has evolved, right? And so as we're going out there and testing, for example, collaborative autonomy behaviors, and we achieve a higher threshold, then that can go back and influence the concept of operations that INDOPACOM is helping us develop. They're a part of our discussions on experimentation. What are the testing events and experimentation events that we need? What do we learn from those events? And therefore, what does the next event need to look like to build on those learnings? They're part of our information disclosure strategy. They are out there forward in the Indo-Pacific. They are the interlocutors to our allies and partners, and also think a lot about how we message this more broadly. And so in every step of the way, they're partnering with us. And as we transition to Replicator 2, we will similarly look for that partnership with combatant commanders even more broadly because, of course, the counter-UAS challenge is distributed across many theaters and areas of responsibility.
Yeah, so I think, and that's it's an interesting point you brought up there in that for Replicator 1, and you think about the China challenge, such as the Chinese invasion of Taiwan as an operational challenge to address. It's pretty specific, and you can think about approaches, some of which we describe in the report, which I put right here to shamelessly plug it.
It's a great report.
Thanks. But that's a fairly tractable operational challenge to analyze and create solutions for. Counter-UAS covers a pretty broad range of potential situations, and UASs that you're attempting to defeat. There's a lot of different defeat mechanisms that are out there. How do you go about thinking about the solution space and trying to, scope it to what is amenable to a near-term solution that you could field at scale?
Yeah, I would say that even with Replicator 1, while the focus was on INDOPACOM, we did work with other combatant commands as well, because a lot of the lessons learned are coming right now from the EUCOM AOR. So what can we, for example, learn from the Ukrainians and what's happening there to inform our systems? And how do we develop them in a way that they are fieldable in multiple different environments? I think that has always been the mindset, even though we are designing some concepts of operations that are focused in the INDOPACOM theater. I think similarly for Replicator 2, we had a chance to talk to some of our commercial partners about this, where there is the homeland defense challenge, and then there is the OCONUS challenge, but even overseas, there are restricted environments, dense environments, populated environments that look very similar. We would think about them very similarly to environments in the homeland. And then, of course, there are conflict zones. And those are different types of solutions that we need to field. And so as we think about them, I think, the homeland defense challenge is going to be probably the biggest one that we need to tackle. And as we think about the types of solutions that we can apply there, we can think about how broadly applicable they are to those other environments, so that we can field something more broadly. Even in the way that we selected Replicator 2 locations, Replicator 2 is focused on protecting our installations and force concentrations. The way that we selected those sites where we would field this capability was very deliberate, because we wanted a sample set that is representative of the global footprint. And so as we field to those sites, we will then be able to draw lessons on how we can proliferate those technologies across the globe.
So the kinds of considerations that have to go into protecting a domestic site, so airspace deconfliction, and the fact that you can't just start shooting guns at drones and have the rounds land in some neighborhood nearby. Those are all things that if you fix them here or address them here, then they can certainly be used elsewhere. And in a combat environment, it just opens up maybe a couple other options. So I assume that's the
that is there. Yes, exactly. I think we start with the most limited environments, and then we go out from there.
So one of the challenges with that approach is then at some point you have to be able to hand this off to an organization that's going to own it and then maintain it and provide operators for it. The whole .LPF part of the chain. How are you working with the, I guess, the services, which
Yes.
are going to be the recipients of these new capabilities to allow for a smooth transition path of this new technology to, because it's mature fielded technology as opposed to an R&D program. It's going to just show up and they now own it. How do you work with them to smooth that transition?
Across the board, DIU has deepened our partnerships with the services. We take on technology on-ramps when we know that there is an urgent warfighter demand and when we know that there is a transition partner in the services, and we work across those communities to create that consensus.
Right.
So I think Replicator One is a good example. DIU is not a program office, and we did not make ourselves into a program office. We continue to play the role of on-ramping best-of-breed commercial technologies and then transitioning them to the service partners who are responsible, as you said, for the .mil PFP activities, as they always are. We want to make sure that we have that transition partner at the end, not adopt those activities in our portfolio. Similarly, with Replicator 2, the services will be front and center. They will be in the lead. They're working with us now to develop the technology laydowns. They're working with us to identify where we have mature technologies that are ready to scale, that they may already be procuring, or they're just getting out of the R&D pipelines and they're ready to procure at scale. And they're working with us to identify areas where DIU or other innovation organizations, the Strategic Capabilities Office and others, can bring in new or different types of technology where we see gaps. Right. So that conversation now will inform our acquisition planning for this problem set, ultimately with the services driving the .mil PFP as they are now for Replicator One.
Right, right. So do the services, I mean, it seems from the service perspective, this is good, right? Because you're getting kind of free money, somebody else's money is being used to buy things that can come into your service and help address problems that you are ultimately responsible for addressing. But I imagine it's also somewhat disruptive. So the service receives this new capability it didn't really plan for. It's having to maybe reorganize itself to accommodate it. Do you find that you have to make adjustments in the program or the system design, or did the service now need to work with the industry provider to make the system more easily transition into the services portfolio?
Yeah, I would characterize it a little bit differently. The services are not, what we're doing is accelerating programs that they are already interested in procuring. And so what DIU is able to provide, with huge thanks to Congress and the budget that they gave us this past year, is that bridge funding. So the services know that they need to scale, for example, attritable autonomous systems or counter-UAS systems in the 1 or 2 years that it takes for their budgets to catch up to the capability. That's where DIU can step in and provide that bridge funding. But our interest is not to foist on the services systems that they are not interested in procuring. And that is exactly why we did not set up a joint program office that is separate. We're working with the service program execution offices and program managers. They're the ones that are part of the conversation. And even in instances where DIU has led, for example, a commercial solutions opening, where we have decided as a team that this is an area where we need to bring in best of breed, the services representatives are part of that CSO from the beginning, from the requirements generation, to the pitches, to the down selects, to the prototype awards, to the production decision, just like the combatant commanders are. So this is really a collaboration where we are taking the lead and a part of that tech development maturity chain, and then we hand it off.
That's a couple of really good points. So one is that DIU is able to bridge this gap in the PPBE, the planning, programming, budgeting, execution process, where it takes 2 years to build a budget. So if you want to add a new program into your service budget, it takes 2 years for it to materialize. And so DIU can step in the intermediate or the intervening time and jumpstart that effort and start bringing systems into the force, and then move those over the service, and then they can eventually create a program around that that they would be able to own into the future.
Or not. It
Right.
doesn't have to be a program of record.
Right.
Some of these technologies may never be a program of record. Yeah.
And then the other thing that you brought up, which was interesting, is that we've been frustrated with, we here at Hudson, with the speed with which the department has been able to pursue uncrewed systems in particular within the services. And it's for a lot of reasons, right? Because the services are very long-term focused. These systems are constantly changing. It's difficult for them to make a decision on, well, here's the one I want to hang my hat on. This approach gives them a way to inject those systems into the force right away, and then gives them a starting point for iteration down the road. So they don't have to come up with the ideal answer within the service. They're going to inherit something that they can start with, and then they could then iterate that into the future.
Yeah, a couple of responses to that. So on the funding side, absolutely. What Congress has given DIU is a larger budget, but I think the most important thing about that budget has been the flexibility in it. And so the PE lines, the budget lines are larger. They're not as prescriptive down to a system level or program level. And the type of funding allows us to move across RDT&E and procurement. That flexibility is what has enabled us to accelerate a lot of the systems that are part of Replicator and our other investment portfolio as well. I think that's been important. With that comes responsibility to be more transparent with Congress and how we're deploying those funds. And so in many ways, I think DIU this year has been at the forefront of proving that model with Congress, which is extreme transparency. We brief Congress on a very regular basis at the line item level on our budget, our obligation rates, our execution rates. And I think that then enables us to have that trust and be stewards of this more agile funding profile. So I think that's really important. And then to your second point, I think what Replicator and again, other parts of DIU's portfolio as well have allowed us to do is think about acquisition in more flexible and smart ways. So how do we do it such that you're not committing to one system for the next 2 decades? Obviously, that is easier to do in some of these domains where the systems themselves are less expensive. But then I'll go back to my earlier point, which is we have invested a lot too in thinking about how to make them that way. So separating the software from the hardware, rather than just having the software solutions provided to us as a by the way solution by the hardware vendor. We recognize the importance of that, so we've decoupled it. And you would have seen DIU leading CSOs just in the software space. So that allows us to have more flexibility. We have more control over those solutions, and it allows us to adapt the hardware systems in more flexible ways. I think that takes away some of the paralysis of which system do I field in the face of technology that is evolving more rapidly. You have to dive in, and you have to be smart about the way that you do that so you can stay ahead without obviously wasting taxpayer dollars. You want to be responsible stewards of that too.
So I think sometimes the DIU doesn't do I think enough to talk about how you guys are pioneering some of this PPPE reform that the PPPE Commission recommended last year in its report. Was we should have more flexible PE lines, and we should give the transparency to Congress that allows them to feel confident that the department is using this broader funding authority responsibly. That's a great point. I mean, I think what DIU is doing could be something that we could then turn around and say, well, this could be applied within the services too, to their innovation arms, because technology is changing so rapidly. It may not make sense to fund uncrewed systems within each of the services in the same way that we fund a crewed platform that has a whole decade of development and decades of life after it.
Absolutely. I do think that those funding structures should be proliferated across more parts of the department. I cannot underscore enough the partnership with Congress on this and the importance of the trust that they have placed in us, and that relationship of continuing to build that trust and really demonstrating how we can use this sort of broader mandate responsibly.
So I want to talk a little bit about the software hardware decoupling, but first one thing I wanted to address was you talked about working with combat commanders and with the services as transition partners and with industry as the providers. increasingly DIU is at the center of a lot of the DoD's innovation efforts. And how does DIU, as part of the Defense Innovation Working Group, or as the leader of the Defense Innovation Working Group, kind of help orchestrate the DoD's innovation efforts to align solutions with operational problems? Because as you noted, there's other parts of DoD that build new technology stuff, DARPA, SCO, the services have their own innovation arms. How do you act as a clearinghouse, I guess, to kind of figure out what's the best source for a solution to this problem that you might be tackling?
You might have heard the term Defense Innovation Community of Entities, the DICE. As part of the last NDAA, Congress empowered us to coordinate and catalyze the DICE community. And the Defense Innovation Working Group is a very valuable forum in doing that. I would say we've deployed it in three key ways. One is clarifying the department's demand signal to the innovation entities within it. Often, those innovation entities do not have a direct line to the combatant commanders and to the services, frankly, to understand where their efforts will create the most bang for the buck for the department more broadly. And so I think the DIWG is a productive forum in that we can hear that demand signal very clearly. We can make decisions about how the department as a whole will move out on those challenges, bringing to bear all the different capabilities and value propositions of the innovation entities. I think that has been hugely valuable. The other side of that is streamlining our engagements with the commercial sector. Right. So now we have more visibility into what other innovation entities are doing, so that the same commercial firm is not getting 5 phone calls from the Department of Defense on the same day on slightly adjacent problem sets. We can coordinate that internally, and we can leverage each other's efforts. And some of that is as simple as investing in a common relationship management platform. Can we all use the same database? And DIU is helping invest in those types of productivity tools internally so that we know and can leverage each other's efforts better. And so I think that has been a game changer. And then the third is actually coalescing around solving challenges for the commercial sector, because all of us are hearing the same things from industry, right? I need SCIF access, my personnel clearances need to go through faster. How do I become cybersecurity compliant? Authorities to operate. These pain points are ubiquitous, and we all hear them the same way. So how can we coordinate our responses to those? And so DIU has, for example, made steps to streamline the cybersecurity accreditation process. So how can we put out a pathway for firms to follow to make sure that they're meeting our standards? And if they're not, how can we connect them with the right resources so they can do it? SCIF access. We have mapped out the SCIF footprint as it exists today across all of these entities that have access to SCIFs all over this country. So can we leverage them, and can we open them up to our vendor base? And where we see key gaps, can we invest then in building SCIFs in those areas? Those are the types of things that we can now coordinate for the department, and it'll be huge value added, I think, and increase our efficiencies as well across the innovation enterprise.
Well, and when I talk to people that are in the smaller or startup industries, small and large, but they all express these concerns that the department's demand signal is uncoordinated, and I get small inquiries from multiple entities, none of which are going to be enough for me to necessarily put the effort into trying to deliver on. And also, I have a lot of just expenses with regard to getting stood up as an organization that can serve DoD. So I need the SCIFs, I need the clearances, I need to have cybersecurity accreditation. So it seems like by acting as that clearinghouse to a degree, you're able to combine a lot of those demand signals and create a more coherent demand signal for industry, which helps them to get to scale, and then also helps them more quickly ramp up. And as opposed to just burning cash while they get their administrative stuff together.
And all of that is enabled, again, by funding. So part of our budget this year included a DICE line. And we leveraged those funds to not only fund some of these enabling processes like the cybersecurity piece, but also to jointly invest in projects. And so if Naval X is looking at a surface vehicle, for example, and DIU has a similar problem set, then how can we pool our funds, to your point about creating scaled opportunities for the commercial sector? How can we pool our funds to do it together? And we deployed funds in partnership with other innovation organizations to do that.
So one thing that this raises for me is thinking about the timeline or the evolution of a new technology or capability that's introduced to DoD. So the services tend to think long term, and they make investments to deliver some capability a decade or more in the future. And then you've got places like DARPA that are solving hard operational problems. But again, the solution is probably a long-term solution, but it's driven by near-term research and development. And DIU is obviously working much more in the near term. As the organizer or orchestrator of some of this innovation effort, how do you attempt to align these near-term efforts with the longer-term efforts so that technologies being introduced today can benefit from follow-on investment that might come through what the services have built into their budgets into the future? And then how do you look at this idea of iterative innovation? So instead of going for the moonshot that takes 20 years to deliver, do we just do a bunch of tiny, less challenging shots that we iterate on for the next 10 years? How do you orchestrate those investments over time with the services, and then how do you think of innovation? Is it this iterative approach or is this moonshot approach?
I think the most important thing we can do and are doing in that space is spotlighting the operational needs, recognizing that there are many different solutions, and in some cases, those solutions are, traditional capabilities, or they might be longer-term development efforts because there's a customer of one for certain types of capabilities and effects, and DIU is not in the business of that. And so, I think our job and our opportunity, frankly, with the Defense Innovation Working Group being as widely representative as it is of all department equities, is to make sure that we're shining a light on the most urgent operational problems, and that we keep that focus steady. I think that's the other piece of it, because there's always the tendency to look ahead to the next thing and the next thing. And so how can we keep the focus? And even for some of these technologies that are evolving rapidly, as I said, we have to commit, right? Like we have to feel them. And so how do we keep the department aligned around that goal? Because that in the long term is what's going to allow us to iterate and continue developing. We are not in the business of coordinating activities for all of these innovation entities. That is not our role. We are focused on commercial tech sector on-ramps. But I think having that platform to say, here is what we're hearing from our combatant commands, I think that is where we have added value. Right,
and it does align with the fact that technology evolution is so much faster now that you can iterate your way to a more sophisticated answer in a relatively short period of time, but instead of having to mount that necessarily, that long-term development program is the only path to being able to get something that is a sophisticated solution.
And a piece of that, I think, is investing as we have in our commercial operations team, so that we have visibility into where the commercial sector is, and not necessarily the defense, but other parts of the commercial sector and dual-use firms, so that we have a good handle on where there might be solutions or components of solutions that we can leverage and bring into some of these larger problems. So, for example, the sanctions recently on Skydio, batteries is something that we can go after. Batteries is something where the technology exists in other parts of our commercial industrial base, and we should be able to bring them and adapt them into this challenge. And then as we adapt those components, they can be useful for all manner of systems down the line, including some longer term development efforts that other entities might be working on, and we can provide some subcomponents that are compliant with our security standards. And so, making sure that we have that network and that visibility into what is happening out there in the technology sector, domestically and overseas. Global partnerships is a big part of our strategy as well, to keep tabs on constantly on what technologies we can bring in. I think that's where DIU can add value.
You talked earlier about this idea of decoupling software from hardware. And the advantages that provides in terms of being able to co-evolve the software and the hardware and achieve greater levels of adaptability, because they don't have to necessarily be fully integrated at every step of the development cycle. So what are some examples of how that's played out in systems that you're pursuing? And when you talk about the software, are you talking about the software for the system itself, or is it also the command and control software that helps you to orchestrate the operation of that system with other systems?
I'll give you the example of Replicator One. So what we're calling the integrated enablers, there are two pieces of that. One is the command and control. So how do we ensure that the portfolio of systems that we're fielding, multiple domains, can communicate with each other and communicate back to operators in highly contested and denied environments. The other piece of integrated enablers is collaborative autonomy. And so how do we increase the level of autonomy, what we call homogeneous autonomy, which is like systems being able to collaborate, and then heterogeneous collaborative autonomy, which is different types of systems. So you may have an air and a maritime system communicating and coordinating their behaviors. Those are two pieces of the software solution that we have pursued independently. And a couple of ways, a couple of things that we're working on now. One is integrating those into the hardware platforms. And so we're taking a concentric approach of what is our minimum viable product, what are the systems that we want to demonstrate success with first, and so we're focusing on integrating there, and then we'll continue to build that out. And by the way, that's not just Replicator portfolio systems. This is a program, these are investments that should dictate the way the department approaches autonomy more broadly. And so eventually this will be a program that touches many of our systems. It is joint, it is cross-service, and that is how we're building it. The other part of that is obviously thinking through how to ensure funding for this, because all things come back to funding, and actually approaching that in smart ways. The department has historically bought software on the cheap, and now what we're doing is saying this is actually an integral part of the solution. So let's fund for it appropriately. This is where the Ukrainians have been very helpful to us, realizing that software upgrades need to happen on the 3 to 4 week timeline, which is incredibly fast and has a cost. So as we think about what our budget needs to look like, we need to bake in this assumption of 3 to 4 week upgrades. And that will lead to significantly different types and magnitude of investment. So we're thinking of that upfront. And finally, figuring out ways with the service PEOs and PMs on the integration piece, how we create that, and how we do that forevermore for our autonomy programs, and thinking about the IP rights that we need to have in the software, thinking about the way that our acquisition and contracting approaches need to change so that even in the future, hardware providers know that integration with this is a key component of success for that system. That is all of the muscle that we're building.
So that brings up some challenges that companies have with their business models, right? So if you're a fully integrated system developer that, like a prime contractor that delivers to the military an airplane that's got all the software built into it, you can make money off of the sale of that, but you can also make money off the software upgrades that happen in the future, and you sort of bake all that in, and you're looking at the downstream costs, basically paying for a lot of your upstream investment in design and initial manufacturing. But if you're now decoupling software and hardware, and if the software provider, are you getting paid on basically a time and materials basis just for the coders to sit down and code? Or would you use a different model, like a fixed price model or something, where you are paying them basically what the market will bear for their software product, which bakes in all the intellectual property and all the investment they made in creating the thing that you're now receiving? So it's not just, I'm not just paying you for the time that your coders were spent putting this into the system, but I'm also paying you for all the whatever investment you made to create that intellectual property in the first place. So are you looking at different contracting models now that you're thinking of decoupling software from hardware?
We are, and this is where the Chief Data and Artificial Intelligence Office, CDAO,
Right.
is a great partner to us, and the lead in lots of ways in thinking through what are the business models
Right.
that will allow the department to continue getting best of breed solutions and incentivize the innovation that we need to incentivize in this space. So absolutely, we're working with them, and they just announced an AI rapid capability office yesterday that will also be looking at some of these issues and how we do this in a way that makes sense for the department, because we need to protect our equities. We need to, for example, have control of our data, and part of that is as being a good customer is providing good data to firms and constantly updating that, refreshing it. We recognize that firms need to retain IP rights on some of their models. Absolutely, that is a business case that they need to maintain. So working with CDAO and with the services to really understand what this relationship needs to look like going forward.
And so one of the things this brings up, if you look at the example of Ukraine, arguably the hardware side of their military is becoming more and more commoditized, except for the things they get from the West, which are the bespoke high-end systems that we've developed for ourselves. But a lot of the stuff they're developing at home, even cruise missiles and rockets and guided weapons that they develop, are relatively commoditized. They're not super sophisticated, they're not highly integrated. The software is really where the capability lies. So does that mean that going forward, we're likely to see a world in which the hardware providers are operating on a more of a scale and low margin kind of business model, and then software is where a lot of the higher margin type of activity is happening?
I think it depends on the capabilities area, and I think we're just starting to understand where the technology is going in these different portfolios. I would say that where we are right now on Replicator One, as we look at these systems, we do have these legacy models of hardware and software. As we develop the software more, we might have to make changes to the hardware to make it more adaptable, and bake that into how we procure these in the future. So I think that is all part of the learning and what we're exposing through this.
And how is DIU working with the industrial base to shore it up? Because a lot of these systems depend on parts, like you mentioned, batteries, but also there's semiconductors. There's also just components that are sourced from a wide variety of places. And if they can tap into the commercial pipeline, then that's great because that's capacity that's available. But if they have to tap into something that's more specialized, then there's going to be a limited number. Are you working with the industrial base of commercial suppliers that you work with to shore up their industrial base in places where it's weak? Besides, the battery is a great point. Are there other examples like that?
Yeah, there are a few ways in which I think we are contributing to strengthening the industrial base along with our partners in ANS and other parts of the department. One, as I mentioned, I think the steady demand signal is the most important thing we can do, right? That is the number one thing we hear from the commercial sector. They can solve long lead items. They can solve a lot of supply chain issues if they just know what the demand signal is, and they can see that in the budgets remaining steady. So I think that has been a huge part of both Replicator and our other efforts, where we are really focused on finding that transition partner. The second piece of that is, as you mentioned, targeting specific areas of the supply chain where we can bring in technologies from the commercial sector to shore that up. I think batteries is a great example. Our Blue US program is a good example where we're looking at certifying drones that meet our security standards, and we're making those available for government purchasing. Another area that we're looking at is in the advanced manufacturing space. And so how do we leverage the capabilities of advanced manufacturers to create partnerships, to create a marketplace, if you will, of capability providers and manufacturers to augment their capabilities. And then the last area I will highlight is our global partnerships portfolio. I think a huge part of strengthening our industrial base is leveraging capabilities in other nations. So we're working with a whole host of countries, including India and Japan and Australia and the UK and others, to develop their technology sectors wherever they are in their development. Some of these allies and partners have incredibly sophisticated commercial and defense industrial bases where we can leverage capabilities. In other areas, we need to build up the connections between the defense industry and that base and help them do that with the lessons that we have learned, all in service of pulling these firms into our CSOs. We want the best capabilities, and also in service of connecting them to their ministries of defense. And so everybody is increasing the level of capability. So that has been a big part of DIU's strategy as well, is really reaching into these allies and partners and developing our partnerships.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So each of the partners you mentioned, or allies, are establishing their own kind of DIU-like organizations to tap into the commercial sector. Yes. And there, you said, various levels of maturity with doing that, and various levels of maturity in their industrial sector. So what it seems like one of the things definitely is bringing the process that you use to work operational problems with an operational advocate, in our case, combatant commanders, but in their case, it'll be different. Have you seen that? Have you worked with them on just what's the process by which they develop an operational problem and that try to marry that up with a potential solution? Because it seems like that's a starting point that they're going to all need to develop on their own.
We're sharing our lessons learned and best practices. Yeah. One of those is working, as I said, in that trifecta. So, what has worked really well for us is the combatant command services and commercial sector. And so how do we build that capability into other DIU-like entities? And strengthening their connectivity to our combatant commands and our services as well, because that is part of it. And then I actually was just in Tokyo last week, having some of these conversations, working, with those ministries to model something like DIU, if they're interested in setting that up, and figuring out what authorities they might need to pursue with their legislatures, what type of funding, what that needs to look like. These are all things where we, in some cases, have a 5 to 7 year head start, and so we can share some of these learnings and jumpstart for them, leapfrog for them, some of the growing pains that DIU went through. And
it seems like there's also opportunities for industry in each of these countries, right? So DIU and the DIU-like entities in other countries working together would also broaden the ecosystem so that overseas provider could be the source for a solution from a CSO that we issue, or comparably a US firm could answer a CSO that comes out of a DIU-like organization, or ASCA in Australia.
That's the aim. And a big part of these partnerships is also the education component to the commercial sector, and how, if you're based in Japan or India, how do you work with the Department of Defense? And we have actually launched, for example, with the Indians, we do an education series on a quarterly basis. We have webinars. A lot of firms have been participating and asking us questions about export controls and ITAR and cybersecurity and SCIF and all the things that they need to think about in working with the DoD. And so that direct outreach to the commercial sector has been a huge part of this as well.
So, and forgive me for the ignorance of this question, but it seems like if we go with the commercial offerings to a greater degree, it does allow you to maybe circumvent some of the normal ITAR limitations, or is that not the case?
We still have to work with our colleagues in the State Department and work through some of those processes. But we do have the other transaction authority, which is the basis of the CSOs. It does allow us certain flexibilities and allow us to move faster. So bringing these firms into our CSO, it's they can come in with a 3-page paper. That is a very different process from anywhere else. And then if that is compelling, and if the pitch is compelling, now you've got a situation where you've got essentially a concierge, for lack of a better word, kind of shepherding you through the prototype and production to production process, and tackling all of these challenges along the way. And I think that can be a very different experience for a firm, especially a non-traditional or small firm, than in other parts of the department where they are countering these challenges alone and dealing with very complicated processes.
Right. And on the other end, contracting officers that don't really understand their business model and how they're organized. So yeah, it definitely helps to have familiarity with how the commercial model works on the industry side. So I want to open it up for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, go ahead, just raise your hand, and then you can say your affiliation and then ask your question.
Yeah, sure thing. First off, thank you, Bryan and Aditi. It's been great to hear this wide-ranging and very informative conversation.
Elizabeth's got the microphone there.
Thank you.
So people at home can hear you.
Yeah, thank you for the conversation you've led thus far. My name is Ross Ford. I'm a private equity investor as well as an adjunct fellow at CSIS. And I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with just one. Leave the floor open. So how do you see attritables kind of being incorporated into a system of systems, particularly in and around the lessons from around jamming and autonomy that we're seeing out of Ukraine? Can you give some examples of how it might fit in and risks that may come from that?
Sure. So, what we're building for the Replicator portfolio in partnership with INDOPACOM is a series of concepts of operation. How would we deploy these systems? And there are various considerations that go into that, some of which are classified, but developing sort of the connections between systems, as I mentioned. So how will they collaborate across domains? And really identifying the targets that we are that we're shortlisting, and understanding the behaviors that will need to occur to prosecute those targets in those denied environments. And the reason that we are investing so heavily in the C2 solutions and the collaborative autonomy solutions is because we want to create lots of optionality in that space, including as new hardware systems come online, bringing them into this concept to make sure that we have a plan for all of the different phases of the operation, which is, again, classified, but all of the different phases of the operation that we will need to prosecute. And how these systems will fit in with a broader portfolio of capabilities that INDOPACOM will deploy. Obviously, there will be traditional capabilities. There will be all sorts of things that are involved in this. So how do attritable systems fit into that concept, and where can they add value?
And GPS independent navigation is part of that too, because I think that's one of the big challenges in Ukraine is that GPS jamming is so prevalent.
Yes, absolutely. And so thinking through these technologies, again, in a modular way so that we can plug and play them and update them, because the countermeasures evolve so quickly.
Right, good point. Other questions? Up here in the front.
Hi, I'm Teresa Marr from Inside Defense. Thank you, Bryan and Ms. Kumar. I was wondering, you spoke a lot about global partnerships, and the NDAA Joint Explanatory Statement authorizers asked for a plan from DIU and other information in a report for kind of planned more geographic partnerships domestically and internationally. Are there any obvious candidates that DIU can speak to?
For our global partnerships portfolio? Yeah, our focus has been in the Indo-Pacific region. So far, we have really deepened our relationship, as I mentioned, with Japan, with Singapore, with Australia. The AUKUS partnership has been a front and center as well, and so doing work with both partners on the trilateral basis. And then, of course, NATO. So this is a broad view. I think where we are right now in our global partnerships portfolio, in the case of some nations, it's about helping them think through what a DIU model could look like, and standing that up, understanding the authorities that they need, understanding what has worked for us in terms of best practices that we were talking about. In other instances where that is further along, it may be something like the educational programs or accelerators, bringing them into the accelerators that we run so they can really get that, high touch, drinking from a fire hose experience of working with the DoD. In other cases where the partnership and the tech sector is mature enough, it's actually pulling them into the CSOs and creating those scaled opportunities, whether it's the prototype awards, which are $1 to $5 million, and hopefully putting them on a pathway to production. And so I think for us, we have over the past year put a lot of hooks in all of these countries. I would like to deepen those partnerships to get more into sort of that end of the spectrum where we're getting companies into our CSOs and into scaled opportunities. I think that is the value add for the department, for their departments, for the commercial sector. So I think that is where we should focus.
Other questions? Well, did you have one other question?
I have others, but
Oh, no, okay. I think that this brings up a good point about the global partnerships and how do we align our efforts with those of allies and partners. They have different time frames and may not be looking for quite the same urgency of solutions as we are. Are you working with their research community within their services that might be doing this longer term R&D to see if there's ways to accelerate or jumpstart their efforts, because they may not all have a DAU-like organization? I'm thinking of NATO in particular, which has Diana,
Right.
which is supposed to be doing this, but it's pretty diffuse.
Yeah.
So and then they've got a bunch of long-term S&T projects under the NATO S&T organization. Do you find you're having to work with organizations that have different timescales in which they're operating?
Absolutely, and we do that in partnership with R&E and ANS on our side.
Right.
In many instances, so for example, Japan just launched their Defense Innovation Science Technology Institute. It is a amalgamation of the DIU mission and the DARPA mission.
Right.
And so working in the context of that, the Australians have a similar construct. The UK is going through a strategic defense review where they're thinking about different models. And so absolutely working with different types of entities. And again, working in concert with R&E, sharing what has worked for us and how we make sure that both the internal organic development efforts as well as the commercial sector on-ramps have a strong presence in bringing the total solution. I think DIU's view is very much that we don't want the commercial on-ramps and view to get subsumed in favor of always going to the internal organic long-term development. That may not be the right answer. And so how do we work with our partners to find that balance and make sure that we're elevating that commercial perspective?
Right. Well, and it aligns the kind of demand side approach that the operational advocate is going to pursue, and with the supply side approach that you're working with industry to try to provide. So I think it seems like you're trying to marry up two parts that often in DoD don't talk to each other very well. So in a lot of ways, that ends up being the beauty of DIU is that you're providing this marriage counseling between the operational commanders and the industry and services that are attempting to support them.
Right, and making DoD a better customer.
Right.
So I think a big part of that demand side is how do we streamline our own processes and get out of our way to present a demand that is cohesive and steady and scaled and incentivizing the commercial sector to work with us.
And providing that demand signal that they can scale to, and they feel comfortable, being able to build a business around.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a great place to stop, and we're also out of time, so it works out well. But thank you very much, Aditi Kumar, for being here today, and for all of you for being here at the Hudson Institute. And we'll be doing future events along these lines going into next year. But yeah, we really appreciate your time and the opportunity to talk about what DIU has been doing.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.